howled low and mournful through the Kharaj mountain range, a sound that seemed less like weather and more like the groaning of something alive. The air bit with an intensity that no gear could fully guard against, clawing through thermal layers and prickling at bare skin. The peaks loomed above the small village of Garan, a village that seemed reluctant to even exist this close to the sacred mountains. Rebecca adjusted the straps on her backpack, her gloves stiff with frost. The village elder had spoken in low, urgent tones during their meeting the previous night. His warnings still hung in her mind like a fog. The Guardians do not forgive. Turn back. We're wasting daylight. Eric snapped, his breath fogging the air. He stomped ahead of the group, his boots crunching against the packed snow. As the expedition leader, Eric carried himself with the surety of a man who had scaled the Andes, the Himalayas, and countless other peaks. But Kharaj felt different, and though he wouldn't admit it, Rebecca caught the way his eyes darted to the mountains' jagged crowns, as if expecting them to move. Luis, the team's medic, lingered behind, staring at the simple carvings on the village gate they'd just passed through. Circles within circles spiraled across the wood, converging into jagged lines like sunbursts or eyes. "You think they're trying to scare us?" he asked, his voice low and uneasy. "They're superstitious," Rebecca replied, though the certainty in her voice sounded forced, even to herself. "Superstition built on centuries of people disappearing," Denise chimed in. The documentarian had her camera slung over one shoulder, already recording despite the glacial cold sapping her batteries. Her voice had a note of excitement, though whether it was genuine or a cover for nerves, Rebecca couldn't tell. One man's myth is another's story, and we're here to tell it. Eric stopped ahead of them, turning sharply. "We're not here for fairy tales. This isn't a documentary on local folklore. Stick to the plan, Denise." The tension between them was palpable, and Rebecca wasn't sure how much longer their fragile cohesion would hold. Every expedition started like this, ambition and adrenaline glossing over cracks that grew with each passing day. The first leg of the climb was grueling. The snow-covered trail snaked up through dense forests of skeletal, frost-coated trees. The deeper they climbed, the quieter it became. The sound of their boots seemed muffled, as though the snow absorbed the noise. Even the wind, which had keened so mournfully below, died to a stillness that pressed against their eardrums. "This is unnatural," Luis murmured during a brief stop to hydrate. Denise was snapping photos of a tree with jagged gashes in its bark. "Looks like claw marks," she said, half joking. Eric rolled his eyes. "Wild animals. Keep moving." Rebecca said nothing, but found herself glancing over her shoulder more than once. There was nothing behind them, only the narrow, sloping trail flanked by silent trees. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. By the time they reached their first campsite, the sun was sinking behind the peaks, casting long shadows that painted the snow in eerie, flickering patterns. They pitched their tents in an open clearing, where the remnants of an ancient stone structure jutted out of the snow. It was circular, its weathered stones etched with the same spiral patterns Rebecca had seen on the village gate. Luis knelt by the structure, his fingers tracing the carvings. "These symbols, they're everywhere. It's like they're a warning or a map," Denise finished, snapping a photo. Her breath fogged the lens. Eric ignored them, focusing on the GPS and muttering about the next day's route. As darkness fell, the silence became oppressive, broken only by the occasional snap of wood as the team fed the fire. Rebecca stared at the flames, her mind drifting to the elders' parting words. "They do not forgive." Her thoughts were interrupted by a sound, a low, distant whistle carried on the wind. She looked up sharply, her eyes scanning the tree line. "What is it?" Luis asked, his face pale in the firelight. "Nothing," Rebecca said, though her voice lacked conviction. The others heard it too, though no one spoke. It wasn't an animal sound, nor the wind moving through the trees. It was intentional, a warning, or a summons. They slept uneasily that night, their dreams filled with shifting shadows and spiraling eyes that seemed to follow them into wakefulness. The morning light was pale and feeble, more a suggestion than a promise of warmth. The climbers broke camp in a haze of sleep deprivation, their faces drawn and pale. Rebecca caught herself glancing at the trees again, searching for the source of the eerie whistling from the night before. Nothing moved, but the forest felt heavier, its silence less like peace and more like a warning. Eric barked orders to pack faster, impatience sharpening his words. The higher we go, the better the weather. If we're lucky, we can clear the ice shelf before nightfall. That's optimism if I've ever heard it, Denise muttered, securing her camera gear. The batteries, fully charged the night before, had drained overnight. As they resumed their ascent, the trail became steeper and narrower. Snow crunched beneath their boots, and the biting wind stung their exposed skin like shards of glass. The peaks loomed above them, shrouded in mist that twisted and writhed, as though alive. The first sign of trouble came just past noon. Luis, trailing slightly behind the group, called out, "Hey, stop! Where's the second rope bag?" Eric turned, his brow furrowing. "It's clipped to Rebecca's pack." "Check it." Rebecca twisted to look at her gear, but the rope bag was gone. The strap it had been clipped to dangled loosely, the fabric frayed at the edge. "It was there this morning," she said, her voice rising with unease. "Sure it was," Eric snapped. "You didn't secure it properly, and now it's gone." "Great. That's half our rope. Gone." Rebecca bristled, but bit her tongue. Arguing would only waste time. "We'll manage," she said, though her stomach churned. Denise crouched, examining the strap closely. "This wasn't wear and tear," she murmured. "It's like something cut it." Eric laughed bitterly. "What? The Guardian snipped it in the night. Come on. It snagged on something. Let's move." As the day wore on, the terrain became even more treacherous. Sheer drops flanked the trail, and the snow grew deep enough to swallow their boots. The oppressive silence pressed down harder, punctuated only by the occasional hiss of wind or the crunch of ice underfoot. Denise stopped suddenly, raising a hand. "Wait," she said, her voice low. "What now?" Eric snapped, his patience visibly thinning. She pointed up the trail. At first, Rebecca saw nothing but jagged rocks and snow-draped trees. Then, her eyes adjusted to the shifting shadows. There, on a ridge above them, stood a figure. No, not stood, hovered. It was tall and impossibly thin, its outline indistinct as if it were woven from the mist itself. For a moment, Rebecca thought her mind was playing tricks on her, but then it moved, a slow, deliberate tilt of the head, as though it were studying them. "What the hell is that?" Luis whispered, his voice trembling. "It's just a tree," Eric said, though his voice wavered. "Come on." But as they started moving again, the figure seemed to dissolve into the mist. Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling it had been watching them, its intent both alien and ominous. By the time they reached the ice shelf, the sun was sinking behind the peaks. Shadows stretched long and black across the snow. The team worked in tense silence, securing their lines for the climb ahead. Rebecca's hands trembled as she looped the rope through her harness, her breath fogging the air in short bursts. Eric went first, driving his crampons into the ice with practiced precision. Rebecca followed, with Luis close behind. Denise was last, her camera dangling from its strap, though she hadn't touched it in hours. Halfway up the shelf, the rope above Rebecca jerked violently. "Eric," she called, panic rising in her throat. "I'm fine," he shouted back, but his voice sounded strained. Rebecca glanced down to see Luis frozen in place, his face pale. "Something's wrong," he said. Denise's scream shattered the stillness. Rebecca twisted to look, her heart hammering. Denise dangled from her harness, her ice axe clattering uselessly to the rocks below. Her rope had snapped clean in two, and she swung wildly against the sheer face of the ice shelf. "Hold on," Rebecca shouted, fumbling with her belay device. But Denise's scream turned guttural, her voice choking off as her eyes widened in terror. Her gaze wasn't on the rope or the ice, it was on something above her. Rebecca followed her line of sight, and her blood turned to ice. The figure from the ridge was back, perched on the ice above Denise. It crouched, its elongated limbs stretching impossibly far, its form flickering like a shadow caught between dimensions. Then it moved. Rebecca could only watch in horror as the figure reached down and touched Denise's shoulder. A pulse of darkness rippled outward, and Denise let out a final, strangled cry before vanishing into the mist. The team clung to the ice, paralyzed with fear. No one spoke, their breaths shallow and fast. "Keep climbing," Eric finally said, his voice a strained whisper. "We don't look down. We don't stop. We keep climbing." Rebecca stared at the empty spot where Denise had been, her mind screaming in protest. But Eric was already moving, his figure a dark silhouette against the ice. Rebecca swallowed hard and followed, the mountain seeming to press down on her like an enormous, suffocating hand. The summit felt impossibly far as the three remaining climbers hauled themselves over the ice shelf. Each breath came as a ragged gasp, the air so thin it seemed to barely exist. Above them, the peaks loomed higher, their crowns obscured by veils of swirling mist. No one spoke about Denise, not openly. Rebecca's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what she had seen. The figure, the thing, had touched Denise, and she had simply vanished. The mist swallowed her whole, leaving nothing behind. Was it real? Or had the altitude and exhaustion twisted her perception? But then there was the rope, cleanly severed, as though by something impossibly sharp. That, at least, was no hallucination. Eric pressed on, his movements mechanical, his jaw clenched tight. Luis was visibly shaken, his eyes darting to every shadow. Rebecca noticed his hands trembling as he adjusted his harness. The silence was oppressive, interrupted only by the crunch of boots in the snow and the faint whistle of wind. It felt as though the mountain itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. They reached a plateau as dusk began to settle, the sun slipping behind the jagged peaks and plunging the world into twilight. Eric called a halt, his voice flat and devoid of its usual command. "Camp here," he said. "We'll push for the summit tomorrow." Luis dropped his pack and collapsed to his knees, his face pale and drawn. Rebecca followed suit, though her eyes kept drifting toward the horizon. The mist had grown thicker, swirling in strange, deliberate patterns. As they set up camp, Rebecca found herself drawn to a cluster of rocks at the edge of the plateau. Something glinted faintly in the fading light. She knelt and brushed away the snow, revealing another carving. This one was larger and more intricate than the spirals they had seen below. The lines were sharp and angular, forming what looked like a humanoid figure with elongated limbs and hollow, oval eyes. Surrounding it were smaller figures, their arms raised as though in worship or fear. "What is that?" Luis asked, his voice tight. He had followed her, his boots crunching in the snow. "It's like the symbols on the gate," Rebecca said. "But this one, it feels more deliberate, like a warning." Luis Sibedet. Why would people carve something like that? To scare off climbers? Or maybe to mark what happened to them, Rebecca replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The fire they built barely cut through the cold. Its flickering light cast long, dancing shadows against the rocks, and every snap of the wood made Luis flinch. He sat close to the flames, rubbing his hands together. Eric paced nearby, checking his gear with meticulous precision. "We keep our heads down tomorrow. No distractions. No looking for symbols or ghosts or whatever the hell you two are obsessed with." Rebecca stared at him, incredulous. "Are you serious? Denise is gone. You saw the rope. You saw." "I saw someone lose their grip and fall," Eric interrupted, his voice harsh. "That's what I saw. And if you don't want to end up the same way, you'll keep your focus on the climb." Luis shook his head. "She didn't fall. You know she didn't fall." Eric rounded on him, his face inches from Luis's. "Do you want to survive this? Because we got one shot to reach the summit and get back down before the weather closes in. So you can either toughen up, or I'll do it without you." "Enough!" Rebecca snapped, stepping between them. "We're not turning on each other. That's whatever it is wants." Eric scoffed but said no more. He retreated to his tent, zipping it shut with an air of finality. Luis stared into the fire, his shoulders slumped. "He's wrong," he said quietly. "About everything." That night, Rebecca couldn't sleep. The wind whispered around the tent, carrying sounds that weren't natural. Faint voices, fragmented words that seemed to twist into the edges of her mind. She reached for her flashlight and unzipped the tent cautiously. The plateau was bathed in an eerie half-light, the mist reflecting the glow of the stars above. Then she saw it. At the far edge of the plateau, where the mist clung thickest, a figure stood. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs impossibly long and angular, its head tilted unnaturally, as though studying her. "Luis," she hissed, crawling to his tent. She shook him awake, her hand clamped over his mouth before he could cry out. "Quiet. Look." Luis followed her gaze, his eyes widening in terror. The figure began to move, gliding across the snow in a way that seemed to defy gravity. What is it?" Luis whispered. Rebecca didn't answer. She was transfixed, unable to look away. The figure stopped suddenly, its hollow eyes locking onto her. And then it raised one spindly arm and pointed. At her tent, the whispering voices grew louder, swirling into a cacophony that seemed to come from all directions. The fire sputtered and died, plunging the plateau into darkness. When the light returned, faint and flickering, the figure was gone. But Rebecca could still feel its gaze, heavy and unyielding, as though it had never left. Luis turned to her, his voice trembling. "We have to leave. We can't stay here." Rebecca's throat tightened. "There's nowhere to go. It's watching us. It knows." And as they sat in the flickering glow of the rekindled fire, they both understood. The mountain was alive, and it was deciding what to do with them. Morning brought no solace. The sky was a flat, unbroken expanse of gray, as if the sun itself had abandoned the peaks. Rebecca, Luis, and Eric packed in silence, their breaths visible in the frigid air. Every movement felt sluggish, as though the mountain's oppressive presence weighed them down. Luis's face was pale, his eyes sunken and haunted. Rebecca wasn't faring much better, her hands trembling as she adjusted her harness. Eric, ever the pragmatist, barked out orders with a hollow bravado that fooled no one. "We reach the summit by midday and descend immediately. No detours, no delays," he said, his voice clipped. Rebecca glanced at him sharply. "You can't seriously think this is just another climb?" "What I think," Eric said, glaring at her, "is that we have one shot to finish this and get out alive. You want to stay and debate ghost stories? Be my guest." Luis muttered something under his breath, but Eric was already moving, his figure disappearing into the mist ahead. The ascent was grueling. The path narrowed, forcing them to move single file along a sheer cliff face. Rebecca's legs burned with every step, her breath coming in short, labored gasps. Above them, the peaks were obscured by swirling mist that seemed to shift and writhe like living smoke. Luis stumbled, nearly losing his grip on the icy rock. Rebecca grabbed his arm, steadying him. "Careful," she said. He nodded, his face drawn and tight. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," he murmured. "You have to," Rebecca replied, though she didn't feel the conviction in her own words. "We all do." They reached a narrow ledge by late morning. Eric called a halt, leaning heavily on his ice axe. He pulled out his water bottle and took a long drink before passing it to Rebecca. Luis sat on a rock, staring into the abyss below. "It's not just the altitude," he said suddenly. Eric frowned. "What are you talking about?" "This feeling, like something's pulling at me. It's not natural." Luis's voice trembled. "It's like the mountain knows. Like it's trying to—" "Enough," Eric snapped. "You're exhausted. Focus on the climb, not your imagination." Rebecca opened her mouth to argue, but the words died on her lips. A sound rose from the mist below, a low, mournful hum that vibrated through the air, growing louder and more resonant. "What the hell is that?" Rebecca whispered, her pulse quickening. The hum became a roar, a deafening vibration that seemed to emanate from the rocks themselves. Luis clutched his head, crying out in pain. Rebecca's teeth rattled, and she struggled to stay upright. The ground beneath them trembled, and Rebecca realized with dawning horror that the entire ledge was shaking. "Move!" Eric shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. They scrambled forward, the roar building to a crescendo. Rebecca risked a glance over her shoulder and froze. The mist had coalesced into a shape, a towering, writhing mass that surged upward like a tidal wave. Within its shifting form, hollow eyes blinked into existence, their gaze fixed on the climbers. Rebecca grabbed Luis's arm and pulled him forward, her heart hammering in her chest. They stumbled along the ledge, rocks crumbling away beneath their feet. The mist surged closer, its icy tendrils reaching for them. They didn't stop until they reached a jagged outcropping of rock that jutted into the void like a ship's prow. The mist hung back, swirling ominously at the edge of the ledge. Eric collapsed onto his knees, his chest heaving. What was that?" he gasped. Luis shook his head, his eyes wide with terror. "It's them, the Guardians. They're real." "No," Eric said, his voice hollow. "It's the altitude. We're all hallucinating. The air up here messes with your head." Rebecca stared at him, incredulous. "You think we all imagine the same thing? The sound, the shaking, It's not real." Eric snapped, his voice cracking. "It can't be, because if it is, then we're already dead." The silence that followed was unbearable. The mist began to encroach again, curling around the rocks like a living thing. Luis shivered, pulling his jacket tighter around himself. "We can't stay here," Rebecca said finally. "The longer we wait, the worse it'll get." Eric nodded reluctantly, standing with visible effort. "Fine, but we stick together. No one lags behind." As they prepared to move, Rebecca glanced back at the mist. For a moment, she thought she saw shapes within it, tall, gaunt figures with hollow eyes watching, waiting, and then they were gone, swallowed by the swirling gray. Rebecca tightened her grip on her axe and followed Eric, her every step dogged by the unshakable feeling that they were being herded. The path grew narrower, forcing them to traverse the knife edge of the ridge. Below, the abyss yawned open like a mouth waiting to swallow them whole. The mist clung to the edges of the trail, curling around their boots and obscuring the way forward. It was no longer just fog. It felt alive, thick with a malevolence that seemed to seep into their bones. Rebecca tried to keep her focus on the next step, but the voices had returned, faint, like whispers carried on the wind. She couldn't make out the words, but their tone was unmistakable, mocking, accusatory, and relentless. She glanced at Luis. His face was pale, and his eyes darted nervously toward the mist. Every now and then, his lips moved, as though answering something no one else could hear. Eric led the way, his pace mechanical and rigid. He had stopped responding to questions or comments, his only focus on putting one foot in front of the other. The trail suddenly widened into a flat expanse of snow, bordered by jagged rocks. In the middle of the clearing stood a solitary stone cairn, weathered and ancient. It was taller than any cairn Rebecca had seen before, its base decorated with the same spiraling symbols they'd encountered at the plateau. "We should go around," Luis said, his voice barely audible. "There's no time for detours," Eric snapped. Luis hesitated, glancing nervously at the cairn. "Something's wrong with it." "It's a pile of rocks," Eric barked, pushing forward. Rebecca stayed where she was, staring at the cairn. There was something off about it, something she couldn't quite place. The spiral seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them, twisting into shapes that made her stomach churn. "Rebecca, come on," Eric called from ahead. She forced herself to move, keeping a wide berth around the cairn. As they passed, the whispers grew louder, swirling around her like a tempest. For the first time, she understood the words, "Turn back, turn back, turn back." She shivered but kept moving. The snow became deeper as they climbed, slowing their progress. The mist thickened, its tendrils creeping higher and tighter, until it seemed to choke the air itself. Rebecca's lungs burned with every breath, and her legs felt leaden. "We need to stop," Luis said, his voice cracking. "We're close," Eric replied without turning. "Keep going." Luis faltered, dropping to his knees in the snow. Rebecca rushed to his side. "Luis, what's wrong?" "They're here," he whispered, his eyes wide and unfocused. "They're all around us." Rebecca followed his gaze. The mist was alive with movement now, shapes flickering just beyond the edge of visibility. Tall, angular figures with hollow eyes. Watching, waiting. "Luis, get up," she said, her voice trembling. "We have to keep moving." He shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I can't. They'll take me if I move." "Luis," Eric shouted from ahead. "Get up, or you'll freeze to death." Luis didn't respond. He seemed frozen in place, his lips moving silently as though in prayer or in conversation. Rebecca grabbed his arm, pulling him to his feet. "I won't leave you," she said firmly. They pressed on, the shapes in the mist growing bolder. Rebecca could feel their presence now, cold and oppressive, like an icy hand gripping her spine. The whispers became louder, sharper, cutting through her thoughts. When the ground began to tremble, she stopped in her tracks. "Eric," she shouted. He turned, his face a mask of frustration. "What now?" The ground split open beneath his feet. Eric let out a strangled cry as the snow collapsed, plunging him into darkness. Rebecca and Luis rushed forward, peering into the chasm. The walls of the crevasse glistened with ice, disappearing into shadows that seemed to writhe and pulse. "Eric," Rebecca called, her voice echoing down the void. There was no answer. Luis staggered back, his face ashen. "We have to go. We can't stay here." Rebecca hesitated, staring into the abyss. The whispers were deafening now, the words blending into a cacophony of despair and accusation. She couldn't save him, but then she felt it, the subtle pull of the mountain, like an invisible hand urging her closer to the edge. "Rebecca!" Luis's voice snapped her back. She turned to him, her heart hammering. We have to keep going." Luis nodded reluctantly, and they stumbled forward, leaving the crevasse behind. The mist pressed closer now, its tendrils wrapping around them like icy chains. Rebecca could feel the mountain's gaze, heavy and unyielding, as if it were daring them to continue. And though she couldn't bring herself to look back, she knew the Guardians were following. The climb turned brutal as the slope steepened, the snow now a thick, clinging weight that dragged at their boots. Rebecca's breath was ragged, each inhalation a battle against the thin, freezing air. Luis was barely keeping up, his face pale, his movements sluggish. The mist was relentless, closing in so tightly that the world seemed to shrink to a suffocating cocoon. Shadows flickered at the edges of their vision, impossible shapes that dissolved the moment they turned to look. Eric would have said this was just exhaustion, Luis murmured, his voice barely audible over the whispering wind. Rebecca didn't answer. She couldn't bring herself to. The memory of Eric's fall into the chasm still gripped her like a vice. But what haunted her more was what she had seen just before he fell, a shadowy figure standing on the edge of the crevasse, motionless and watching. The trail disappeared completely, forcing them to scramble up an ice-covered slope. Rebecca's hands burned as she gripped her axe, chipping away at the frozen surface. Each strike echoed unnaturally, the sound bouncing back at her from every direction. Halfway up, she heard it again, a whisper, louder now, almost a voice. "Rebecca!" She froze, the ice axe slipping from her hand. The voice was low and guttural, yet somehow familiar. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, looking down at Luis. Luis was staring at her with wide, glassy eyes. "They're speaking to you," he said. Before Rebecca could respond, the ice beneath her shifted. A loud crack reverberated through the air, and the slope shuddered violently. "Climb!" she shouted, digging her axe into the ice. Luis scrambled upward, his movements frantic. The cracking grew louder, spiderweb fractures racing through the frozen surface. Rebecca reached for a secure hold just as the slope gave way. She swung her axe desperately, catching a jagged edge of rock as the ice collapsed into a roaring cascade of snow and debris. Luis clung to the ledge above her, his face twisted in terror. "Rebecca, I'm fine," she shouted back, though her grip was slipping. She pulled herself up with trembling arms, the sound of the avalanche fading into the distance below. They sat on the ledge for a moment, catching their breath. The mist had cleared slightly, revealing the jagged peak above them. But instead of relief, Rebecca felt dread, because now she could see them clearly. The Guardians. They stood on the ridge above, tall and gaunt, their forms shifting and flickering like shadows caught in a storm. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly, fixed on Rebecca and Luis with an intensity that made her chest tighten. Luis stared in stunned silence, his breath hitching. "They're real," he whispered. Rebecca didn't answer. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the figures. There were 3 of them, their limbs impossibly long, their bodies stretched and warped as though they were struggling to maintain form. One of them raised a spindly arm, pointing directly at Rebecca. Her mind screamed to move, to run, but her body refused to obey. A sound filled the air, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from within her own skull. Images flashed through her mind. Her brother's face, smiling on the summit of another peak. The photo she carried in her pocket, now crushed and damp. She saw his final climb, the moment he vanished into a storm much like this one. The voice returned, clearer this time. "You brought them here?" "No," Rebecca whispered, shaking her head. "I didn't." The hum grew louder, and the images became sharper, more invasive. Her failures, her fears, her guilt, all laid bare before her. She didn't realize she was crying until Luis grabbed her arm. "Rebecca, look at me!" His voice broke through the haze, and the images stopped. The hum receded, leaving an aching void in its place. "We have to move," Luis said urgently. "They're trying to get in our heads." Rebecca nodded, wiping her face. The Guardians hadn't moved, but their presence was suffocating, an unrelenting weight pressing down on her soul. They pushed forward, the peak now tantalizingly close. But every step felt heavier, as though the mountain itself resisted their progress. The mist thickened again, and with it came the whispers, louder, more insistent. Rebecca caught fragments of words, half-formed sentences that wormed their way into her thoughts. "Why did you leave him? Is it worth it? You'll never leave." Luis stumbled beside her, clutching his head. "They're inside my mind," he gasped. I can't block them out." Rebecca grabbed his hand, squeezing it tightly. "You can. Focus on me. Focus on my voice." He nodded weakly, but his steps grew slower, his shoulders slumping. Rebecca kept her eyes forward, refusing to look back at the shadows gathering in the mist. But she couldn't ignore the growing certainty in her mind. The mountain wasn't just alive, it was feeding on them. And it wasn't done yet. Rebecca pushed onward, every step a battle against the biting wind and the growing weight of her fear. The summit's jagged silhouette teased her in the distance, but the mist had thickened to a near-solid wall, its tendrils curling around her boots, her gear, and her mind. Her legs screamed with exhaustion, and the cold had seeped deep into her bones, but she refused to stop. The alternative, to stop, to surrender, was unthinkable. The mountain seemed to sense her defiance. The whispers returned, louder now, rising and falling like waves against her skull. They weren't just voices anymore. They were fragments of her life, twisted and weaponized. "Why didn't you stop him?" The voice was her brother's, sharp and filled with pain. Rebecca clenched her jaw, her breath fogging in short bursts. "You weren't supposed to climb alone," she whispered, though she knew no one was listening. "You didn't stop me," the voice pressed, echoing around her. "You knew I wasn't ready. You let me die." She stumbled, her boot catching on a rock hidden beneath the snow. She fell to her knees, gasping for air. The weight of the mountain bore down on her, pressing her into the icy ground. Through the mist, the shadows began to stir again. They moved closer now, no longer content to lurk at the edges of her vision. Rebecca forced herself to stand, her hands trembling as she gripped her ice axe. The shadows coalesced into shapes, tall, angular figures with hollow eyes that gleamed like distant stars. They surrounded her, their movements slow and deliberate, like predators circling wounded prey. Rebecca swung her axe, the motion clumsy and desperate. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice breaking. The figures didn't flinch. They didn't even seem to acknowledge her. Instead, they tilted their heads in unison, as though studying her. The whispers grew deafening, a chorus of voices overlapping and merging until they were indistinguishable from the howling wind. Rebecca clamped her hands over her ears, but the noise burrowed deeper, sinking into her mind like claws. She ran. The trail was barely visible beneath the snow and mist, but she didn't care. She stumbled and slid, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The figures moved with her, gliding through the mist like wraiths. Her foot caught on a jagged rock, and she tumbled forward, landing hard on her chest. The impact drove the air from her lungs, and she lay there for a moment, staring up at the swirling gray sky. When she opened her eyes, one of the figures was standing over her. It loomed impossibly tall, its elongated limbs bending in ways that defied logic. Its hollow eyes bored into hers, and she felt a cold unlike anything she had ever known, a cold that went beyond flesh and bone, sinking into her very soul. "You do not belong here," the figure said. Its voice was a symphony of tones, deep and resonant, yet somehow devoid of emotion. Rebecca scrambled backward, her hands digging into the snow. "What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head again, its movements unnervingly fluid. "You trespass. You defy. You must pay the price." "I didn't mean to." "Intent is irrelevant." The figure extended a spindly hand, its fingers impossibly long and sharp. Rebecca braced herself, but the hand stopped inches from her chest. "Your guilt sustains us," it said. "Your fear feeds the mountain." Rebecca closed her eyes, her body trembling. She thought of her brother, of his laughter and his reckless determination. She thought of the day she had let him climb without her, convinced he'd be fine. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. The figure's hand recoiled, and the whispers faltered. The silence that followed was crushing, but Rebecca forced herself to stand. "I'm sorry," she said again, louder this time. "I can't change what happened, but I won't let you take me." The figure hesitated, its hollow eyes flickering like dying stars. The other shadows began to dissolve, their forms unraveling into the mist. The path ahead became visible again, cutting through the fog like a scar. The summit loomed in the distance, closer than it had ever been. Rebecca gripped her axe tightly and took a step forward. Then another. The shadows didn't follow. For the first time, the mountain felt still, as though holding its breath. The whispers were gone, replaced by the sound of her own heartbeat. She didn't look back. The summit was within reach. Rebecca could feel it, the air thinner and sharper, the sky a darker shade of gray tinged with the faintest traces of light. But each step was harder than the last. The snow grew deeper, clinging to her legs like chains, and the path ahead twisted unnaturally, as though the mountain itself was reshaping to resist her. Her body ached, her lungs burned, and her thoughts swirled with fragments of memories she couldn't trust. She had seen Luis fall, his body swallowed by the mist. She had heard the whispers of the guardians and seen their hollow, watchful eyes. And now she was alone. As she climbed, Rebecca noticed the terrain shifting. The snow beneath her boots gave way to ice, slick and jagged, reflecting a fractured version of her face in its surface. The ice was black as obsidian in places, and in others, it shimmered faintly, as though lit from within. Carvings began to appear again, etched into the ice. The spirals and angular figures were more intricate here, more deliberate. They seemed to ripple and move when she wasn't looking directly at them, twisting into new patterns that made her stomach churn. At the edge of the path, a small altar rose from the ice, its surface jagged and raw. It was adorned with offerings, pieces of gear, fragments of bone, and scraps of fabric that looked disturbingly fresh. Rebecca paused, her breath fogging the air. She reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing a climbing helmet half embedded in the ice. The name Denise was scrawled on its side in faded marker. Her stomach twisted, and she pulled her hand back as though burned. The air grew colder still, and the wind began to howl, carrying with it fragments of sound, laughter, sobbing, and voices that were painfully familiar. Rebecca shook her head, trying to drown them out. You could have saved him, a voice whispered, her brother's voice. You should have stopped me. I didn't know, Rebecca murmured, clutching her axe for support. I didn't know you'd. The laughter rose, cruel and mocking. Didn't you? Rebecca screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. It echoed into the void, swallowed by the wind. When she opened her eyes, the summit was closer. The path had straightened, the jagged terrain giving way to a narrow ridge. Rebecca forced herself forward, step by agonizing step. The mist thickened again, clinging to her like a second skin. She could feel the guardians now, their presence heavy and cold. They didn't need to appear. She knew they were there, watching, waiting. As she climbed, the path abruptly widened into a vast, flat expanse. The summit wasn't a peak but a plateau, its surface smooth and glistening like polished glass. In the center stood a massive stone monolith, its surface etched with spirals and symbols that pulsed faintly with a sickly green light. Rebecca approached slowly, her breath catching in her throat. The monolith towered over her, its presence oppressive and undeniable. A low hum began to rise, vibrating through the ice and into her bones. It was the same sound she had heard earlier, but now it was stronger, more resonant. You have come far, a voice said, echoing from everywhere and nowhere. Rebecca turned, but there was no one. Why do you climb? The voice asked, deep and resonant, layered with tones that didn't belong to any human throat. To survive, Rebecca whispered, her voice trembling. To conquer, the voice corrected, cold and accusatory. No, Rebecca said, her hands clenching into fists. I didn't come here to conquer anything. I came to defy. The voice interrupted, louder now. To take what is not yours. To trespass. The monolith began to glow brighter, its symbols writhing and shifting like living things. Rebecca fell to her knees, the weight of the mountain pressing down on her with crushing force. I didn't mean, she began, but the voice cut her off. Your meaning is irrelevant. Your presence is your sin. The hum grew deafening, and Rebecca's vision blurred. The ground beneath her seemed to ripple, and she felt as though she were sinking into the ice. I'm sorry, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry for everything. The pressure eased, and the hum faltered. Rebecca opened her eyes, and the monolith's light dimmed slightly. Regret does not absolve, the voice said, quieter now. The mountain demands its due. Rebecca's heart sank, but she forced herself to stand. Then take it, she said, her voice shaking. But let me leave. Let me go. The silence that followed was unbearable. And then, slowly, the mist began to recede. The monolith's glow faded, and the whispers fell silent. The path behind her reappeared, leading back down the mountain. Rebecca took a shaky step forward, then another. She didn't look back. As she began her descent, the wind carried a final whisper. You will return. The way down was nothing like the climb. Where the ascent had been grueling, the descent felt surreal, like moving through a dream where the rules of reality no longer applied. The mist no longer clung to Rebecca's skin, but it drifted in strange patterns, swirling and parting in ways that seemed deliberate. Her legs moved on their own, driven less by willpower and more by a primal need to escape. The mountain was quieter now, the whispers reduced to faint murmurs that echoed in the back of her mind. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was watchful, charged with the unspoken promise that the mountain's gaze remained fixed on her. The first marker of familiarity was the altar she had passed earlier. It loomed out of the fog like a specter, its offerings still frozen in place. Rebecca slowed as she approached it, her breath catching in her throat. Something had changed. The climbing helmet with Denise's name was gone. In its place was something new, a small, tattered notebook. She hesitated, then reached for it, her fingers brushing its frozen surface. When she opened it, the pages were blank, save for one in the middle. A single sentence was scrawled there in jagged, blood-red letters. You cannot leave what you carry within. Rebecca shut the notebook with trembling hands and dropped it onto the altar. She turned away and kept moving, the weight of the message pressing down on her. The further she descended, the more the mountain changed around her. The ice and snow gave way to jagged rock, slick with a faint sheen that glinted like oil. The air grew thicker, heavier, making every breath a struggle. Rebecca stumbled over a loose rock and fell hard, her hands scraping against the ground. She lay there for a moment, her body trembling with exhaustion. When she looked up, she saw something that stopped her heart. A figure stood on the path ahead, half shrouded in mist. It was tall and angular, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the gloom. But this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it were more figures, dozens of them, their forms blending into the shadows like they were part of the mountain itself. Rebecca scrambled to her feet, clutching her ice axe. "What do you want?" she shouted, her voice cracking. The figures didn't move. They simply stared, their gaze heavy and unyielding. "You cannot leave," a voice whispered, faint and distant. Rebecca gritted her teeth, forcing herself to take a step forward. Then another. The figures didn't block her path. They simply watched as she passed, their eyes tracking her every move. By the time she reached the lower slopes, Rebecca's body was shaking from exhaustion and cold. The mist had thinned, and the first faint traces of sunlight began to filter through the clouds. But the relief was short-lived. Ahead of her, the remnants of their base camp came into view. The tents were half collapsed, their fabric torn and flapping weakly in the wind. Equipment was scattered across the ground, some of it buried in the snow. Rebecca's heart sank as she approached, her eyes scanning the wreckage. She found Eric's GPS, cracked and useless, and Denise's camera, its lens shattered. There was no sign of the others. No footprints. No bodies. Rebecca sank to her knees, her breath hitching in her chest. She had made it back, but the mountain had taken everything. As she sat there, staring at the wreckage, a sound broke the silence. A faint, distant hum that seemed to rise from the very ground beneath her. Her head snapped up, her eyes darting toward the mountain's peak. The mist was already beginning to thicken again, curling upward like smoke from a dying fire. "You will return," the voice whispered, closer this time. Rebecca shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "I won't. Never again." But as she stood, a shadow flickered at the edge of her vision. She turned sharply, but there was nothing there. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faintest hint of laughter. The village at the base of the mountain looked different in the pale moonlight, as if the familiar buildings and winding streets had warped slightly in her absence. Rebecca staggered toward it, her boots crunching against the icy ground. Every step felt heavier, as though the mountain were trying to pull her back. The village was eerily silent. No dogs barked, no voices carried from the warmly lit windows. The few lanterns that flickered in the cold wind seemed dim, their glow failing to pierce the darkness. Rebecca reached the village square, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. She dropped her pack and slumped against a weathered bench, her breath fogging in the chill air. She was alive. She had made it. But as her heart rate slowed, unease began to creep in. The elder of the village emerged from the shadows, his hunched form wrapped in thick woolen robes. His face was obscured beneath the hood, but Rebecca recognized the carved staff he carried. The spirals etched into its surface mirrored those she had seen on the mountain. "You have returned," he said, his voice gravelly and distant. Rebecca nodded weakly. "I made it. The Guardians." Her voice faltered as she searched for the words. "They let me go." The elder tilted his head slightly, as if studying her. "You do not understand." "What do you mean?" Rebecca asked, her stomach tightening. "You are not free," he said. "The mountain does not simply release its prey. It spares you for a purpose." Rebecca's breath hitched. "I don't know. I survived. I escaped." The elder stepped closer, his staff tapping against the frozen ground. "Did you?" he asked, his tone heavy with meaning. The village began to shift around her. Shadows danced at the edges of her vision, and the faint hum that had followed her down the mountain returned. Rebecca's pulse quickened, and she scrambled to her feet. "What's happening?" she demanded, her voice rising. The elder gestured toward the mountains. "You have been marked. You are part of the mountain now, and it is part of you." You carry it with you, wherever you go. Rebecca shook her head violently. No, I'm done. I left. I survived. The elder's gaze didn't waver. You cannot escape. The mountain always takes what it is owed. Rebecca backed away, her boots slipping on the icy ground. She turned and ran, the village blurring around her as she moved. The buildings warped and twisted, their shapes shifting impossibly. The hum grew louder, the sound vibrating through her chest. She stumbled into the woods, the trees stretching unnaturally tall around her, their branches curling like claws. The path beneath her feet was the same one she had taken up the mountain, yet it seemed endless, looping back on itself. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. You will return, they said. You cannot leave. She collapsed to her knees, clutching her head. Her thoughts fractured and blurred, memories of the climb overlapping with fragments of her past. The faces of Luis, Eric, and Denise flickered in her mind, their voices mingling with the whispers of the Guardians. When she opened her eyes, she was back on the trail, the summit looming ahead. No, she whispered, her voice breaking. This isn't real. But the mountain's presence was undeniable. The cold bit into her skin, the mist swirled around her, and the path stretched onward. Rebecca stood slowly, her body trembling. She looked back, but the village was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of snow and rock. The mountain was all that remained. The whispers grew softer, almost soothing now. You belong to us, they said. You always have. Rebecca tightened her grip on her axe, her mind teetering on the edge of despair. She had fought so hard to escape, to survive. But now, standing on the frozen path once more, she realized the truth. The mountain was never something you left behind. It was something you carried with you forever. Rebecca took a deep breath